They called her a coward. They stripped her wings, humiliated her in front of the entire base, and told her she'd never fly again. But hours later, the world watched in disbelief as that same simple woman climbed into an A-10 Warthog, dove headfirst into the battlefield, and erased an armored division in a single strike. What she did that day shattered every record the world's finest soldiers swore could never be broken. And the twist at the end will leave you speechless. This is the untold story of Elara Vance, the pilot they tried to erase, only to watch her rewrite the fate of a war. Welcome to A Simple Woman. Hit subscribe, smash the bell, and let's check in. 1 if this is your first time, 2 if you've seen a few, 3 if you never miss. They called her a coward. It didn't matter how many hours Major Elara Vance had logged in the cockpit, how many near misses she had turned into victories, or how many young pilots she had saved with quick instincts and sharper reflexes. To the men who measured courage by blind obedience, Elara's refusal to play their games made her weak. On that morning, under the blistering sun and the thunder of turbines, the word cut sharper than any blade. Coward. The squadron had assembled on the flight line, rows of cadets standing at attention as the commanders prepared to address them. Captain Dax Moran, polished and smiling with that smug superiority of a man convinced of his own legend, circled her like a predator. He spoke loud enough for the entire base to hear, his voice dripping contempt. This is Major Vance, the so-called pilot who flinched when asked to prove herself. She hesitated in front of her own squadron. Tell me, cadets, is that bravery? The laughter that followed was cruel, nervous, and desperate. No one wanted to be the one who disagreed. Elara kept her head up, her jaw locked, her fists tight in her gloves. She had not flinched out of fear. She had refused because the exercise Moran proposed was reckless showmanship. A simulated dive over civilian terrain, pointless and dangerous. She knew the line between bravery and arrogance, but no one wanted to hear it. Not when the game was to humiliate her. General Horace Kellan stepped forward, a man carved from iron and protocol. His eyes were narrow, his voice like gravel as he addressed both Elara and the watching cadets. A soldier who cannot follow orders is worse than useless. She endangers every life around her. She is not an example to follow. She is an example to fear becoming. He reached forward, ripped the insignia from her chest, and let it fall into the dust. His boot crushed it as if to grind her name out of existence. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the laughter again. Cadets emboldened, pilots smirking, mechanics whispering. Elara felt the heat in her chest, but refused to let them see her bend. She bent only to retrieve the torn insignia, brushing the dirt from it with trembling fingers. Moran sneered. Careful with that, coward. It might be the last honor you ever touch. They dragged her off the flight line as if she were a criminal, too. MPs gripping her arms, their boots echoing against the concrete. The roar of turbines mocked her, jets lifting into the sky that should have been hers. She twisted once, catching the gleam of sunlight off the canopy of her beloved A-10 Warthog. The machine she knew like an extension of her own body, the machine she was now forbidden to touch. Inside the barracks, they shoved her into a room with nothing but a chair and a radio she wasn't meant to use. The door slammed. The lock clicked. Alone in the half-light, Elara sat with her knees drawn tight, the insignia clutched in her hand. The word echoed in her mind, coward, but she replayed the truth behind it. She wasn't afraid to fly. She was afraid of flying for the wrong reasons. of turning war into theatre, of men like Morin demanding obedience even when it meant death. The radio crackled. She froze, leaning close. Through static she heard voices, the chatter of pilots, the clipped commands of controllers, the low thrum of a sky preparing for battle. She wasn't supposed to hear it, but every word carved deeper into her. The enemy was moving. A division of armor, hundreds of tanks and mechanized vehicles, was pushing toward the border. The base was scrambling to respond. Elara closed her eyes. She could see it already, the ground trembling beneath the weight of steel, the sky burning. With contrails, young soldiers crying out for air support that would not come fast enough. She had flown above armored divisions before. She knew the horror they could unleash, and she knew what her A-10 could do to them if only she were allowed back into the sky. But she wasn't. Not now. Not ever, if Kellen and Morin had their way. Her fists clenched. She thought of the cadets who had laughed, who had believed Morin's words without question. She thought of the insignia in her hand, broken but not erased. And beneath it all she felt the fire that had always driven her. The refusal to watch from the ground while men and women bled and died. They could call her reckless, they could call her a coward, but they would never call her absent when it mattered. Outside, the alarms began to howl. Red light strobed against the walls of her confinement. The sound of boots thundered across the tarmac, of engines roaring into life. The battle was coming, and she was locked away, condemned to silence. Elara stood, pressed her forehead against the cold steel of the door, and whispered to herself, "You can ground me, you can strip me, but you will not stop me." The war was waiting, and so was she. The alarms grew louder, a chorus of dread that shook the walls of Elara's confinement. The base had trained for years, drilled endlessly for the possibility of an enemy push. But no one had ever expected it to come like this. Fast, brutal, and overwhelming. She pressed closer to the barred window, squinting out into the night. The runway that had been her stage of humiliation hours ago was now a blur of frantic motion. Fuel trucks screamed across the tarmac, ground crews waving frantically with glow wands, sweat shining in the floodlights. Mechanics clambered over wings, slamming panels shut. Pilots sprinted in partial gear, helmets under their arms, scrambling into cockpits as klaxons bled into the roar of jet turbines. Elara gripped the sill, every muscle in her body trembling. She knew the sound of war building, the way the earth seemed to shift under the weight of an advancing armored division. The rumble carried even here, a vibration beneath her boots, as though the tanks themselves were already clawing toward the base. The radio on the desk burst to life. She spun toward it, holding her breath as voices screamed through the static. Enemy armor confirmed. One full division pushing hard on Sector 9. Eagle Squadron, hold formation, do not scatter. God, they're everywhere. I've got multiple locks. Static swallowed the transmission, then replaced it with the jagged scream of a pilot in trouble, cut short by silence. Elara's stomach lurched. She knew that silence. She had flown enough combat to recognize the end of a call sign, the moment a comrade became debris. Her fingernails dug into the desk. She was locked away while the very thing she had been trained for was happening above her head. The A-10 seconds were in the air, but she could tell from the chaos in the comms that Morin's command was faltering. He might strut on the tarmac, but leading men into the teeth of armored fire was another story entirely. His arrogance had no answer for disciplined steel. Another burst of chatter broke in. They're breaking through. Enemy armor at the river. We can't hold them. A different voice, panicked and sharp. I can't get a shot. They're tearing us apart down here. Elara's throat tightened. She could see it without looking. The convoys of tanks grinding forward, the infantry crushed beneath treads, artillery spitting fire into the night. And overhead, young pilots flailing against missile locks they couldn't outfly. She could almost feel the weight of the A-10 Avenger cannon beneath her fingertips, the rhythm of its 7 barrels tearing into armor, the way the A-10 vibrated like a living thing when it spat steel. Her Warthog was designed for this fight, but she wasn't in it. She was a prisoner in her own base. Her eyes flicked to the door, heavy, padlocked from the outside. She tested it once, then again, slamming her shoulder against it until her bones ached. Nothing. Her chest heaved, her fists clenched, her pulse drummed louder than the sirens. She couldn't just sit here. Not while soldiers screamed for cover, not while a division of armor closed in to erase them all. She scanned the small room. Tools, crates, spare parts discarded by mechanics. Then she saw it, a crowbar, leaning against the far wall, its surface slick with grease. She lunged for it, wrapping both hands around the cold steel, one strike against the lock. It clanged but held. Again, sparks spat. Her breath came harsh and ragged, but she didn't stop. Outside, boots thundered past the barracks, soldiers racing to stations. No one came for her, no one even thought of her. That invisibility gave her cover. She raised the crowbar high, drove it down with everything left in her arms. The lock screeched, bent, then finally split with a sharp, metallic cry. The door swung open. Elara staggered out, chest burning, sweat streaking down her temples. The night hit her like a wave, heat, smoke, the acrid stench of fuel. She pressed herself against the shadow of a truck, scanning. MPs sprinted in the opposite direction, rifles clutched but eyes wide with panic. No one looked her way. She was free, but freedom meant nothing without wings. Across the runway, under the brutal glare of floodlights, she saw them, the A-10. Seconds, lumbering beasts armed to the teeth, their shark-toothed noses gleaming. Some were already gone, their exhaust trails slicing into the black sky. Others were burning, crumpled wreckage at the edge of the tarmac. But one stood ready, its canopy open, engines silent, abandoned in the chaos. Its fuselage gleamed as if waiting for her. Her heart slammed against her ribs. That was her chance. That was salvation. Elara ducked low, weaving between fuel hoses and crates, her breath short, her body alive with adrenaline. She could hear the radio clipped at a soldier's belt as he sprinted past. "We've lost Eagle 2 and Eagle 6! Moran's down. Repeat, Moran's bird is hit." Her lips curled in grim irony. The man who had branded her a coward was spiraling from the sky. She reached the ladder, gripping it with trembling hands. The A-10 loomed above her, massive, scarred but intact. She climbed, each rung like a heartbeat pulling her closer to destiny. Sliding into the cockpit, she pulled the canopy down, sealing herself inside. The world outside dulled, the chaos muffled. Her hands moved instinctively, flicking switches, powering up systems. Displays flickered, panels hummed, the machine awakening under her touch. It was like slipping into her own skin, after being forced to wear chains. The radio crackled again, filling her helmet with desperation. "Armor's breaching the line. We need support now." Elara tightened her harness, her eyes sharp, her voice low but steady. "Then you'll get it." The canopy sealed with a hiss, and suddenly the chaos outside became distant, muted, like another world. Inside the cockpit, Elara Vance felt the hum of life returning. Switches flipped beneath her fingers, gauges came alive, green lights flickered across the dash. The A-10 Warthog was waking up, its heart ready to roar. Her gloves tightened around the throttle. For hours, they had called her coward. For hours, she had been forced to watch while others crumbled in the sky. Now it was her turn. She pushed the engines to life. The turbines whined, then roared, the entire frame trembling with raw power. Floodlights swung toward her. Soldiers on the ground screamed in confusion. MPs sprinted, waving arms, shouting for her to stop. A jeep cut across the runway to block her path. Elara gritted her teeth, slammed the throttle forward. The A-10 lunged like a beast unchained, its nose lowering, its cannon glinting beneath the lights. The jeep swerved aside at the last second as she thundered down the runway. General Kellen's voice erupted over the comms, thick with disbelief. "Vance, shut that bird down immediately. That's an order." She didn't answer. The end of the runway loomed, flames flickering from burning wreckage just yards ahead. Elara pulled back on the stick, engines howling, and the A-10 clawed itself into the sky. For a heartbeat she was weightless, the base dropping away beneath her. Then the battlefield opened before her eyes. Smoke stretched across the horizon. The ground burned in patches of fire where friendly shells had fallen short. And beyond the river, the enemy's armored division crawled forward like a wall of steel. Tanks by the dozen, lines of mechanized vehicles, artillery pounding with mechanical precision. The earth shook under their advance. Above them, tracers lanced through the night, a cage of anti-air fire daring any plane to approach. Elara steadied her breathing. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon sat ready beneath her, its 30mm rounds loaded, 7 barrels primed to unleash hell. She had trained for years for this moment, dreamed of the day she could use the Warthog for what it was born to do. Now it was here. She angled the nose down. The dive began. Wind tore at the fuselage, the altimeter numbers dropping in a blur. The anti-air fire erupted instantly, glowing tracers streaking upward, surrounding her like a cage of light. Alarms screamed in her ears, missile lock warnings howling. She jinked left, then right, skimming so low her belly almost scraped the treetops. A missile shot past, detonating in a shower of sparks above her canopy. Her target was dead ahead, the lead column of tanks grinding forward, barrels raised like a forest of iron. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 thundered. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a roar that shook the night, a monstrous growl of steel spitting fire. The Warthog bucked under the recoil as streams of depleted uranium shells ripped into the tanks below. Armor that had been built to withstand everything the enemy possessed crumpled like tin. Explosions burst along the column, fireballs consuming crews before they could even return fire. Elara pulled up sharply, smoke whipping across her canopy. Behind her, the battlefield was a chaos of burning hulks, a line of steel shattered in seconds. Her voice cut across the comms, sharp and commanding. "Follow my lead, low and fast, hit their flanks." Surviving pilots, their voices ragged with panic, answered instinctively. They had mocked her, doubted her, but in that moment they clung to her certainty. 2 A-10s dropped in behind her, their cannons roaring as they raked the armored lines. But the enemy wasn't done. From the ridge, mobile missile batteries rose, locking onto her heat signature. A warning shrieked in her helmet. Elara slammed the stick into a barrel roll, the missile streaking past so close the blast rattled her bones. Another surged toward her. She cut throttle, dropped like a stone, and at the last second reignited afterburners. The missile overshooting and detonating harmlessly in the clouds. She laughed, a sharp, breathless sound. "Is that all you've got?" Her eyes found the next target. The command vehicles at the center of the division. "Knock those out." and the armor would collapse into confusion. She dove again, skimming just meters above the treetops. Bullets peppered her wings, anti-air tracers slicing the night, but she pressed forward. She armed her missiles, locked and fired. The command convoy erupted, flames spiraling into the sky. On the ground, the enemy advance faltered. Tank crews shouted in panic, formation splintered. Some broke backward, retreating into smoke. Others fired wildly into the air, blind to her movements. She had turned their wall of steel into chaos, but the sky was far from safe. 2 enemy fighters screamed in from the east, their afterburners flaring as they locked onto her. Elara cursed under her breath. The A-10 was built for punishment, not speed. In a straight chase, she would never outrun them. She rolled hard, hugging the valley floor, forcing the faster jets to follow low. They overshot, their missiles slamming into empty hillsides. Elara pulled up, lined one in her sights, and loosed a missile. The fighter burst into flame, tumbling end over end into the ground. The other banked sharply, breaking away. She didn't chase. Her focus returned to the tanks. The GAU-8 growled again, the battlefield lit by fire and fury as another armored platoon was erased in a hail of 30mm shells, her comms filled with stunned voices. She's tearing them apart. I've never seen flying like this. Even Kellen's voice, usually iron and unyielding, cracked with something close to awe. Elara didn't hear them. She was lost in the rhythm. Dive, fire, climb, roll, dive again. Every pass shattered another piece of the armor division. Every burst of cannon fire turned disbelief into legend. By the time her cannon clicked empty, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The once unstoppable division was a graveyard of burning steel. Smoke curled into the night sky, the earth littered with wreckage. Soldiers who had braced for slaughter now stood in stunned silence, staring at the angel of death who had saved them. Elara banked her Warthog, circling the devastation below. For the first time in hours, her voice softened, calm but unbreakable. "This is Major Vance, the coward you left behind. Sector 9 is clear." The comms went silent, not with disbelief anymore, with reverence. The battlefield smoldered beneath her. Columns of black smoke twisted skyward, blotting out the stars. Burning tanks littered the fields like broken toys, their hulks glowing red against the night. For a moment, there was only the growl of Elara Vance's A-10 engines and the hiss of her oxygen mask. But the silence across the comms said more than words could. The division that had been called unstoppable was gone. She steadied her breathing, forcing her focus forward. There was no time to bask in the wreckage. Through the haze, new radar pings flickered across her HUD, reinforcements pushing toward the eastern flank. It wasn't over, not yet. Her voice snapped across the channel, sharper now, commanding, "All remaining units form up on me." There was hesitation, a long pause filled with static. The same pilots who had mocked her as reckless, who had laughed as she was dragged from the flight line, were stunned into silence. Then a young voice answered, raw and shaking, "Copy, Major Vance," forming up. Another followed, then another. One by one, the survivors aligned behind her call. Elara pulled her Warthog into a wide arc, smoke trailing from her battered wings, and the others fell into position. Not neat, not perfect, but present. They were alive, and they needed her. She was no longer flying alone. The enemy armored reinforcements crested a ridge below, lines of headlights glowing like predatory eyes. They fired wildly into the night sky, artillery shells slamming into the earth with bone-shaking fury. Elara angled downward, the A-10's nose dipping once more toward the storm. "Low and tight," she ordered. "We hit them where it hurts. Stay with me." The squadron followed. They dove as one, engines screaming, tracers stitching through the night. Elara's GAU-8 roared again, chewing through the lead tanks, detonations ripping fire into the darkness. Her wingmen strafed the flanks, their cannons hammering armored carriers and artillery. The enemy line crumbled like wet paper, their formation breaking under the relentless assault. In the control tower, officers watched in stunned disbelief. General Kellen gripped the railing, his voice hollow. "She's leading them." Around him, cadets pressed against the glass, wide-eyed as the woman they had scorned became the anchor holding their entire defense together. On the ground, soldiers lifted their heads from the trenches, their eyes tracking the Warthogs as they dove and climbed, dove and climbed again. Cheers began to rise from the battered infantry, raw voices shouting into the chaos, "Vance! Vance! Vance!" Elara didn't hear them, but she felt it, the shift, the weight of lives depending on her. Each dive became sharper, each strike more precise. She wasn't just flying anymore, she was conducting, orchestrating destruction with a precision that seemed otherworldly. Missiles streaked past her canopy, heat-seeking tendrils of death. She rolled hard, diving into the smoke, dragging the lock until the missile wasted itself against a burning husk below. Another fighter cut across her path, guns flashing. Her wingman screamed as his bird took fire. Without hesitation, Elara banked, cutting behind the enemy jet, and unleashed a missile. It exploded mid-sky, shrapnel raining down like sparks. "Stay tight!" she barked. "They break you apart, you die! They break you apart, we all die!" The squadron's voices answered, firm now, no longer hesitant. "Copy that, Major. Staying tight." The battle spiraled into chaos, but Elara turned chaos into rhythm. Each command cut through panic. Each maneuver pulled her pilots back from the brink. Slowly, impossibly, the tide shifted. Where an armored juggernaut had advanced with unbreakable confidence, now it burned in twisted heaps. Where pilots had panicked, now they fought like a blade sharpened under her hand. In the command bunker, intelligence officers stared at live feeds. Numbers scrolled across their screens, impossible numbers. Kill counts rising, casualty reports dropping. One analyst whispered, This shouldn't be possible." Another turned to Kellen, his voice shaking. "Sir, she's rewriting doctrine up there, alone." Kellen said nothing, his jaw clenched, his pride unraveling as he watched the pilot he had called. Reckless command, a victory larger than any simulation had dared to predict. Elara's oxygen rasped against her mask, her body screaming from the G-forces, her hands raw from gripping the stick. But she kept flying, her eyes locked on the final push of armor retreating toward the river. "Final run!" she called. "Line up on my mark." The squadron dove in formation, a battered line of steel angels tearing through smoke and fire. Their cannons spat fury into the last of the armored division, shells punching through turrets, detonations swallowing the retreat, and then silence again. Where once a division had threatened annihilation, now only wreckage remained. A field of fire and twisted steel stretching to the horizon. The river glowed red under the burning sky. Elara circled once, her voice cutting steady through the comms. "This is Major Vance. Enemy division neutralized." Repeat, neutralized. The tower erupted. Voices shouted over one another, disbelief giving way to awe. In the trenches, soldiers who had prepared to die now raised their rifles in salute. Across the base, cadets whispered her name as if speaking it too loud might break the spell. And somewhere deep in the Pentagon, generals hunched over satellite feeds leaned back in stunned silence. A single pilot, branded coward, had turned the tide of a war. Elara's jet rattled, alarms wailing, fuel running low, ammunition spent. but her voice was calm. "We're going home." The squadron followed her across the night sky, their formation ragged but intact. Below them, the battlefield still burned, a testament carved in fire to the woman who had led them. For Elara Vance, this was not redemption, it was revelation. She had not just fought, she had become legend in real time. They brought her into the tribunal hall at dawn. The night smoke still clung to her flight suit, streaks of soot across her face, bandages wrapped around her hands where shrapnel had torn through. She walked between two guards, though neither dared to touch her. The steel doors opened to reveal a chamber crowded with officers, cadets, mechanics, and wounded pilots who had refused to stay in the infirmary. At the center sat General Horace Kellan, rigid in his chair, his uniform immaculate as if untouched by the night's chaos. At his side, senior commanders flown in during the battle's aftermath. Their eyes burned with suspicion, curiosity, and something else, the uncomfortable weight of gratitude. Elara was ordered to sit at a single table in the middle of the room, alone under the harsh light. Her helmet was gone, her insignia still torn, but her posture was unshaken. She had faced fire and steel. This, the judgment of men in uniforms, no longer frightened her. Kellan's voice filled the hall, cold, measured, every word hammered with authority. "Major Elara Vance, you disobeyed direct orders. You broke confinement. You stole military property. And you risked the lives of every man and woman on this base with reckless disregard for protocol. Do you deny any of this?" Every eye turned to her. The silence was suffocating. Elara let it linger before she answered. Her voice was steady, low, but carried to every corner. "I deny nothing. I disobeyed. I stole. I broke every rule you put in front of me, and in doing so, I saved you all." A ripple passed through the crowd. Some gasped. Others dropped their eyes. Kellan's jaw tightened, his fists curling. "You dare justify insubordination with arrogance?" Elara met his stare without flinching. "I justify it with victory. You grounded me for being reckless. But last night, your discipline failed. Your protocols shattered. And if not for what you call recklessness, this base would be ash, and every soldier here would be a name on a wall." The room was silent. The weight of her words hung heavy, undeniable. Cadets shifted uncomfortably, remembering how they had laughed at her. Mechanics glanced at each other, recalling the sight of her A-10 diving into hell, while others faltered. Even the wounded pilots, bandaged and pale, straightened in their chairs. One of the senior commanders cleared his throat, his voice gravelly with age. "Major Vance, the records confirm what you claim. 14 confirmed armor kills, dozens more vehicles destroyed, enemy command neutralized, an entire armored division routed, alone." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Such results have never been recorded in this theater, not by a squadron, not by a wing, not even by our finest." Another officer muttered under his breath, almost in awe. "Impossible." Elara's reply was quiet, but it carried like steel. "Impossible is why I did it." The crowd shifted again, a ripple of recognition. In that moment, her defiance wasn't arrogance, it was undeniable truth. Kellan rose from his chair, slamming his palms against the table. "Enough! This is not how the military survives! We do not live by lone heroes, we live by discipline. You—" He stopped. Because the room had changed, the silence was not submission, it was judgment, turned back on him. The cadets who once echoed his commands now stared at Elara with reverence. The mechanic stood straighter, eyes locked on her instead of him. Even his fellow officers glanced his way with uncertainty, their respect wavering. The weight of the room had shifted. power flowing toward the woman he had tried to erase. For the first time, Horace Kellan faltered. One of the senior commanders spoke, his tone measured but unyielding. "General, we cannot ignore her actions. By every account, Major Vance accomplished what should have been impossible. If we condemn her, we condemn our own survival." Kellan's lips tightened. He wanted to argue, to remind them of the rules. But what argument could stand against the battlefield still burning with her victory? He looked at her, soot-streaked, scarred but unbroken, and in her gaze he saw the truth. She no longer needed his approval. She had already become something greater than his authority. The commander leaned forward. "Major Vance, what drove you to take that risk? To fly alone into that division?" Elara didn't hesitate. "Because no one else would. Because when everyone else froze, I couldn't. I didn't fly for medals. I didn't fly for glory. I flew because silence was not an option." The hall stayed silent. Not the silence of disapproval, but the silence of awe. Kellan lowered himself back into his chair, defeated not by argument, but by the absence of support. His authority, once unshakable, had been eclipsed by a single act of courage. The senior commander's voice rang again, final this time. "Major Vance will not be court-martialed. She will not be dismissed. Instead, she will be commended for extraordinary valor." A murmur of relief and reverence swept the room. Elara didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply sat there, steady as stone, the torn insignia still in her hand. She didn't need their medals. She had already carved her name in fire. The silence held, deep, reverent, unbreakable, the kind of silence reserved only for the impossible. The tribunal doors swung open, the hinges groaning as Elara Vance stepped into the pale morning light. The air outside was heavy with the smell of burnt fuel and scorched earth, the remnants of the battle still drifting across the horizon. Her boots struck the concrete with measured steps, the torn insignia still clutched in her hand. She expected whispers, maybe the same mocking laughter that had once chased her down this very flight line. But instead, she was met with something far more profound. Silence. Lining both sides of the walkway stood the entire base. Cadets in wrinkled uniforms, mechanics with oil-stained hands, medics smeared with blood from the wounded they had carried. Through the night, even the injured pilots had dragged themselves here, leaning on crutches or the shoulders of comrades. From the tribunal doors to the hangars, they stood in two unbroken lines, forming a corridor that stretched toward the very runway where Elara had been branded a coward only hours before. Not a single word was spoken. Not a single whisper broke the air. Helmets were tucked under arms, backs straight, eyes forward. It was not ceremony. It was not order. It was choice. Elara paused at the threshold, her chest tightening. Her memory flashed back to the humiliation, dragged across this same concrete, jeered at, stripped of her honor. Now those same eyes that had once mocked her refused to look away. They watched with reverence, as though blinking might break the vision before them. She took a step forward. The silence deepened. Boots shifted as the corridor seemed to close tighter, not in hostility but in unity. A mechanic she remembered sneering at her days before, now snapped into a salute, grease still staining his fingers. A cadet who had laughed the loudest on the flight line raised her trembling hand in the same gesture. One by one the line followed. Salutes spread down the corridor like a wave. Elara walked on, her stride slow but unwavering. Each face she passed carried the same expression. Awe mixed with regret, humility welded to respect. They no longer saw the reckless pilot. They no longer saw the coward. They saw the woman who had risen alone into the sky and crushed a division of steel beneath her wings. At the far end stood General Horace Kellen. His posture was stiff, his jaw locked, but his eyes betrayed him. He had tried to bury her beneath ridicule and regulation. Now he had no power left to wield. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow and saluted. The ripple finished. Every hand along the corridor rose, 1,000 silent acknowledgements. Elara stopped, the insignia patch still crumpled in her fist. For a moment she considered pinning it back onto her chest. But no, the cloth was torn, and her honor no longer lived in fabric or rank. It lived in this silence, in the eyes of those who had once doubted her. She slipped the insignia into her pocket, lifted her chin, and walked past Kellen without a word. The corridor parted before her, salutes frozen in place until she passed. When she reached the end, the ruined A-10 still rested on the tarmac, its fuselage scarred, its paint blackened by smoke. It stood like a monument to what she had done, a testament carved in steel and fire. Elara placed her hand on its battered side, then turned back toward the corridor. The silence held. No cheers, no shouts, just reverence. The kind of silence reserved not for soldiers following orders, but for legends carved in defiance. And in that silence, Elara Vance walked not as the coward they had once named her, but as the pilot who had become impossible to forget. The smoke had barely lifted from the battlefield when the first reports reached Washington. Satellite feeds replayed the impossible dive over and over, one lone A-10 carving through. A wall of steel, the GAU-8 cannon roaring as armored columns exploded in fire. In the Pentagon, analysts stared in disbelief. Generals leaned over the footage, their voices low, their faces pale. One pilot did this, one asked. Not just a pilot, another replied, almost reluctant. Major Elara Vance, the one they grounded. Numbers scrawled across the monitors, 14 confirmed armor kills, 24 vehicles disabled, enemy command annihilated. A full armored division reduced to wreckage by a single sortie. Doctrines and war manuals that had held unchallenged for decades suddenly looked obsolete. What entire wings had failed to achieve, she had accomplished alone. Across the ocean, enemy officers reviewed the same footage. Their silence was different. Not reverence, but fear. Whispers spread through their ranks about the woman in the Warthog, a name that carried weight like a storm on the horizon. Soldiers who had once laughed at propaganda now shivered at the memory of the cannon's growl. Back at the base, cadets spoke in hushed tones. The same young men who had called her reckless now passed her name, with awe, as though saying it too loudly would diminish its power. "She dove right through the flak," one whispered. "I saw it." The sky lit up like it was tearing apart, and she didn't pull back. Another shook his head, eyes wide. "She erased tanks like they were paper targets." No one else could do that. In the hangars, mechanics gathered around the wreck of her A-10. Its paint was scorched, panels twisted, wings shredded. Yet they touched it carefully, reverently, like a relic. One placed his hand on the blackened fuselage and murmured, "This bird went to hell and came back." General Kellen tried to reassert his command, barking orders, reminding everyone that the base was still a military unit. But even his voice carried less weight now. The cadets who once jumped at his word now looked first to Elara. The mechanics glanced at her before moving. Even the senior officers who had once stood at Kellen's side in judgment now softened their tone when she entered the room. Legends did not ask permission. Legends simply were. Elara herself said little. She returned to her barracks quietly, set her scorched flight gloves on the wall, and stared at them for a long time. To her, it wasn't glory. It wasn't vindication. It was necessity. She had done what had to be done when no one else would. The fact that it had become myth overnight didn't change the truth. She had simply refused to stay silent. But outside, the legend grew. Newspapers splashed the headline, "One pilot crushes a division." Analysts debated her tactics on live broadcasts, struggling to explain maneuvers that no textbook could justify. Cadets began sketching her silhouette on notebooks, carving her initials into benches. Soldiers on the ground told and retold the story, each time more vivid, more impossible, until Elara's dive became something larger than war itself, and through it all, she remained what she had always been, a simple woman, once called a coward, now a name etched in fire. They would try to bury her again. They would try to wrap her in medals, parade her in ceremonies, rewrite her into a doctrine they could control. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence of the corridor, the salutes given freely, the whispers that carried farther than any command. Because on that night, Elara Vance proved something that no tribunal, no colonel, no general could ever erase. That courage is not obedience. Courage is the refusal to stand down when the world demands silence. She was dragged off the flight line in shame. She returned from the sky as a legend. And this is why we tell her story, because they tried to erase it, because they tried to bury it, and because stories like Elara's remind us of what can never be silenced. So if you've stayed with us until now, thank you. This is a simple woman, where the tales they tried to hide live again. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments, what part of Elara's journey struck you the hardest? Was it the word that branded her a coward, or the silence that crowned her a legend? Stay with us. More stories await on the screen now. Stories of women who stood alone and rewrote history.